We're here today to speak with Dr. Rajeswari Sengupta, a professor of economics who's extensively studied the Indian economy over the last 10 years. Her research interests lie in the fields of international finance, monetary policy, the financial sector, and national accounts measurement. And she will be speaking with us about the problems with official data in India. Thanks for speaking with us today, Rajeswari, and welcome to the Big Idea series.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I think to start us off, can you tell us about the importance of official data in the country and what are broadly the main problems with India's statistical system?
Absolutely. So, the availability of reliable, credible, timely, and good quality official data is a very important requirement for effective policy making in any country. This data tells us how the economy is performing, how various sectors are faring, how different economic agents, such as firms and households, are getting by. And this, in turn, is a critical input in understanding the kind of policies that need to be designed in order to ensure growth and development at all levels. However, if the data itself is questionable, then everything that is dependent on the data, such as economic policy making, is going to become erroneous and misdirected. This is deeply problematic because, as we understand, economic policies impact the lives of all citizens of the country. Now, specifically in the Indian case, ironically, there was a point of time in the post-independence period when the statistical system in India was world-renowned. But since then, over a period of time, the quality and strength of the system have slowly but steadily become significantly diluted. In fact, in recent years, the trust, the credibility of India's official statistics has hit a rock bottom. And the entire statistical system has been mired in controversy, especially since the release of the 2011-12 base year series of the national accounts, which got released in 2015. And it is safe to say that by now, in India, today we have a severe crisis of data and statistics. Now, one can speculate that maybe one of the potential reasons behind this gradual decay of the quality of the statistical system is resource constraint. The central government spends about 0.2% of the union budget on the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, which is the ministry primarily responsible for official statistics. And only 25% of this gets allocated towards statistical and data collection activities. There are staff shortages, and as we understand, the best statisticians of the country don't join the National Statistics Office today because, of course, the private sector pays much more handsomely. Over and above that, there's political interference, there's lack of autonomy, and inadequate adoption of modern technology. Bottom line, India's statistical system is becoming increasingly ill-equipped to deal with the data requirements and data challenges of a fast-growing, large economy.
Okay. So, specifically, what are some of the major data issues that the economy has been suffering from?
Correct. So, let me talk about three important problems with India's official statistics, right? So, they are primarily in the category of data delays, lack of autonomy, and communication problems. Now, with regard to data delays, let me give you two examples. Since 1881, India has had a population census every 10 years. In fact, we may not realize this, but very few countries in the world can boast of something like this. In India, the population census has never been delayed, no matter how adverse the circumstances were. For example, even during the Sino-India War of 1961 or the Bangladesh liberation fight of 1971, the Indian census was not delayed. Irrespective of whether there have been wars, famines, droughts, political instabilities, natural disasters, census in India has never been postponed. But this uninterrupted run of the population census got derailed in 2021. The last decennial census was held in 2011-12, right? But since then, we have not had a population census, which means it's a delay of more than 10 years. Now, the census was scheduled to be held in 2021. But of course, the official statement, the official reason given behind the delay was the COVID-19 pandemic, right? But curiously enough, as we know, during the pandemic, particularly during the severe second wave of the pandemic in 2021, several elections in large states of the country were held with full-fledged campaigning, right? And it's also worth noting in this context that not only the developed countries of the US and the UK or large emerging economies like China, but even Nepal and Bangladesh were able to hold population census during the COVID period from 2020 to 2022. Even in the context of India, as we know that the pandemic has long ended, right? All manners of economic activities are back in full force. The economy is back to being fully functional. Yet, 3 years after the pandemic, the census has not been held yet. It's been indefinitely postponed, and we don't know the reason yet because nothing has been communicated by the authorities. Now, why is the delay in population census so important? Census in India is the single largest source of statistical information on different characteristics of the people of India. This information is used by policymakers as well as researchers in the fields of economics, sociology, anthropology, and so on and so forth, which means people working in all these fields are essentially working with outdated data that is more than 10 years old. Several demographic changes have happened across geographical boundaries over the last 10 years, right? But this does not get reflected in our survey results, essentially meaning that our surveys are effectively misrepresenting reality. And surveys are a very important instrument for compiling data series, both at the national and at the subnational levels. For example, there has been massive urbanization and rural-urban migration in India over the last decade. But the sampling frame that is capturing rural-urban populations is more than 10 years old, which means any socioeconomic indicator on rural or urban areas is essentially conveying a picture that does not match with the reality. Moreover, the census is also crucially important because it provides an accurate sampling frame for our surveys. Survey estimates for any region or any community are scaled up to the population level using census data. But in absence of an updated census, our sampling frames of our surveys are essentially outdated, right? Let me give you another example of data delays, which are very important. The Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, which is a crucial input into all kinds of macroeconomic indicators like GDP, consumer price index, etc. Typically, that survey used to be held every 5 years, right? The last survey, there was a survey that was held in 2011-12, right? Since then, we have had only one survey whose results were officially accepted. This survey was conducted recently in 22-23, and the results were released earlier this year, which means there has been a gap of 10 years in the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey. And why is this important? As I said that the results of this survey play a crucial role in reviewing various important macroeconomic indicators like GDP, CPI, as well as the country's poverty levels. This means that over a period of 10 years or more, we have not had the required information to update these macroeconomic indicators. For example, retail inflation, which is captured using the consumer price index, is totally out of touch with reality because the weights in the CPI index are based on the results of the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey of 2011-2012. That survey assigned a heavy weight to food in the household consumption basket. But we now know from the recent survey of 22-23 that the weight assigned to food in the average consumption basket has come down. Now, this is very relevant in the current times because over the last couple of years, food inflation has been quite high in India. And in fact, it has been a serious matter of concern for the Reserve Bank of India. But clearly it turns out that the inflation data based on which the RBI has been conducting its monetary policy does not capture the average inflation that is faced by the representative household in India. Because as I said, the weights in the CPI basket are not updated. So essentially such data delays lead to severe problems in policymaking. Let me come to the third problem, which is to do with communication gap. The statistical system in India is largely opaque. There is practically no mechanism using which data users can communicate with data producers. For example, when the 2011-12 base year series of GDP was released in 2015, a wholesale change was done in the method by the NSO, by the National Statistics Office. But very little information was released in the public domain, clarifying all the changes that were implemented. And very soon, the official statistical system essentially clamped down in the face of all the criticisms that were happening, because there was a lot of discordance between what the GDP numbers were showing and what many other high-frequency indicators were conveying about the economy. But till date, we do not know what changes or corrections have been made to the national account series, to the GDP series, in response to all these criticisms. There is practically no engagement with stakeholders or data users from the side of the statistical authorities. And what this does is, it makes the system much more ad hoc and discretionary, as opposed to being more well-structured and well-defined. And this further erodes trust in the official statistics. For example, stakeholders need to know what surveys are going on, when the results will be released, are there new surveys that are being planned, what is the schedule of the data releases, right? Even now, what seems to be happening is almost randomly, some surveys, some new data gets released, some new survey gets conducted, and we come to know about it as and when the survey is underway without any idea when the results might be released. For example, during 22-23, we came to know that the new household consumption expenditure survey was underway, whose results were released earlier this year. We also came to know that a survey on unincorporated sector enterprises was started from 21-22, and there was a bit of a delay in the release of that survey results as well. The stakeholders and data users once again were not informed when the results would be released. Once again, the results were recently released. So, given this lack of communication between the statistical authorities and the data users, the suspicion about the credibility of the official data gets further entrenched, right? The statistical system in India almost operates like a secret mission. And the thing is, they are funded by taxpayers' money, which means that they're accountable to Indian citizens and they need to be held to high standards. But right now, there is very little transparency and accountability of the statistical system. So, the data delays, I gave you two examples, the census delay and the household consumption expenditure survey delay, then the communication problems, which is just all over the place. The third problem has to do with lack of independence. It increasingly seems to be the case that if the results of a particular survey are not palatable to the government in power, then that survey is either, the report is either withdrawn or is not even released. And this, in fact, happened in 2019. So there was a household consumption expenditure survey that was conducted in 2017-18 as per schedule, right? The 2011-12 survey, roughly 5 years later, 17-18, a survey gets conducted. The results of that survey, part of it got leaked in the media. And in November 2019, the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, MOSPI, refused to officially release the results of the survey. Why? Because whatever was released in the media showed that there was a decline in average real consumption, perhaps for the first time in 4 decades. And of course, this is not a result that would be politically palatable. Similarly, in the same year, in April 2019, the National Sample Survey Office released a report. I think that also was partly leaked in the media, published a report which showed that unemployment rate in India has reached higher than 6%. Once again, this is not politically convenient, particularly in the election season, and the government openly and publicly refused to accept the report, even though the National Statistical Commission had accepted the report. In fact, the then acting chairman of the National Statistical Commission resigned, citing undue political interference. Several independent members of the NSC also resigned for the same reason, right? So increasingly, we see that whenever the results are not something that is favorable to the government in power, there is this undue political interference, political pressure on the statistical agency to withdraw the report. And by now, this political interference or political pressure has become so pervasive that questions about the lack of autonomy of the National Statistics Office have become very commonplace. So these I would characterize three very serious kind of problems with delays in data release, lack of autonomy, and of course, communication gaps. And of course, we can talk further.
Yeah. So I think that gives us a view of the overall picture of what kind of problems are present. But you've done a lot of work on measurement issues in the GDP series specifically. Can you tell us about some of these issues?
Sure. In fact, this was one of the starting points of the recent debate that started about the quality and credibility of the official statistics in India, as I was saying in 2015. Now, GDP, or gross domestic product, is one of the most important macroeconomic indicators in any economy. It captures the overall performance of the economy as well as performance of various sectors. In 2015, when the new GDP series was released, we got to know that, or all data users and stakeholders got to know that the NSO, back then it was called the CSO, the Central Statistics Office, had undertaken a wholesale change in the way GDP is calculated in India, right? New input databases were used, new methodology was used, lot of changes were being done. And as a result, the new series showed that India was the fastest growing large economy in the world. But the aggregate picture that was conveyed by the GDP numbers were discordant with many of the other trusted data sources that are used to understand the state of the economy. And this discrepancy, which persisted for a while, of course, led to a vigorous debate amongst statisticians, economists, and other experts, etc., about what exactly the GDP data is conveying. Now, let me summarize the three main problems with the GDP data. The first and foremost is the use of a new and contentious firm-level database called the MCA21 database, which is owned by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. This is a key input data into the compilation of the new series of GDP, but there are many inconsistencies and gaps in this database. One of the most glaring ones is the case of missing firms. In 2019, an NSS report showed that many firms which are listed in the MCA21 database could not be traced, or they are misclassified, meaning they were classified to be in a particular sector, but they turned out to be, when the enumerators went to the firms, these firms turned out to be in a different sector. As a result of which, it could also be possible that many of these firms are shell companies, which are effectively not engaged in any economic activity, but they are being plugged into the GDP compilation process, which means that there could be potential overestimation of the GDP data because of the presence of all these missing firms. Ideally, when a new data set is being used, it should be validated and it should be tested, but that was not done. Also, very importantly, the MCA21 database should have been made publicly available, maybe through a query-based system or something like that, so that data users and stakeholders can assess the reliability and robustness of this new database that is being used. But that has not been done either. The second problem is about the GDP deflator. Much has been written about it. I have written a lot of articles on this as well. What's the problem with the GDP deflator? So without getting too technical about it, in the old methodology, the way it was done was that real GDP was predominantly derived from volume-based indices, such as the index of industrial production, etc. And real GDP growth, for the most part, was directly calculated. So the deflator or problems with the deflator didn't really matter much. But in the new method, the way it is now done is that nominal GDP numbers are first calculated, and then price indices are used to deflate them to arrive at real GDP numbers, which means now the deflator becomes of crucial importance, right? If the deflator, for example, understates inflation, then the real GDP growth rate will be overstated, and vice versa. And this has been a serious problem. Now, internationally, how is this problem solved? In most of the countries around the world, the producer price index is used as a proxy for output prices, and that is used as the main deflator, right? But in India, the NSO does not use the PPI, the producer price index, because in India, we don't have a PPI. So instead, the NSO uses a different proxy, which is the wholesale price index. The problem with the WPI is that it is heavily skewed towards commodities such as oil, which means that whenever there is a steep decline in commodity prices, the WPI will decline, even when producer prices or retail prices may increase. And mind you, in commodity importing countries like India, commodities like oil are crucial inputs. And this is exactly what happened when the GDP series was released. For example, between 2014 and 2016, because of a fall in commodity prices, such as oil prices, the average WPI inflation was minus 1.2%, which means WPI was in a deflationary zone, essentially implying that the real GDP growth rates of that period were overestimated. The same problem recurred in 2020-23, when the average WPI inflation was minus 1%, meaning that the real GDP growth rate of that year, in 23-24, which we now know is to be 8.2%, was also overestimated, right? Because the WPI is falling because of commodity price decline, but it is artificially inflating the real GDP growth rate. Now, the other way around can also happen. So, for example, in periods when there is a commodity price spike, the WPI inflation can be very high, but that will end up underestimating the real GDP growth rate. So you have a situation where, because of the deflator problem, in some periods the real GDP growth can be overestimated. In some periods it can be underestimated. But this is seriously problematic for policy making, because policymakers are designing policy based on real-time data. The third important problem with the GDP series has to do with the unorganized sector, what we also often refer to as the informal sector. The unorganized sector, it employs more than 90% of the labor force and roughly contributes about 40% to GDP, which is extremely important. But there is no organized or proper database which will capture the economic activity that is going on in the unorganized sector. Roughly what happens is, occasionally there is a survey that is being conducted, survey of unincorporated enterprises, to estimate the activity happening in that particular year. And for all subsequent years, the growth of the unorganized sector is extrapolated, mostly using proxies. Now, many of these proxies are derived from the organized sector or the formal sector. Essentially, this means that the assumption is that the unorganized sector is growing at the same rate as the organized sector. Now, as long as these two sectors are growing in tandem, this approach can still work. But the problem happens when their growth rate starts diverging, which is exactly what happened from 2016 onwards, right? Once again, remember, this is right after the new GDP series was released in 2015. Now, in 2016, we had the demonetization, which was a severe blow to the unorganized sector, because almost all the firms, enterprises in this sector are cash-based. And in demonetization, overnight, 86% of the cash in circulation was declared illegal. Then comes the implementation of the goods and services tax from 2017 onwards, which entailed very costly and difficult adjustment for the informal sector, for the unorganized sector enterprises. After that, in 2018, there was a big problem with the NBFC sector, the non-banking finance company sector, because of a default of a major NBFC. This was another blow to the unorganized sector, because many enterprises in this sector are dependent on NBFCs for funding. And then, of course, comes the mother of all shocks, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know from ample anecdotal evidence that the COVID-19 shock disproportionately impacted the unorganized sector much more than the organized sector. Which means that as a result of these series of shocks from 2016 onwards, the growth of the unorganized sector has diverged significantly from that of the organized sector. But to the best of our knowledge, the NSO has not made any adjustments to the manner in which they compute the growth of the unorganized sector. And this, of course, is going to lend an upward bias to the GDP growth numbers. So these are, I would say, the three main problems in the GDP series that we are currently using in India. The problem in the MCA21 database, which to the best of our knowledge have still not been addressed, despite endless criticism and lot of studies and research that have gone into it. The second is the problem with the deflator, which has been written about extensively. Once again, we haven't heard anything from the statistical authorities about whether they're planning to use or figure out or design a PPI, or another better, or at least a rough proxy of solving the problem could be even using the CPI as a deflator, because the CPI is not dependent so much on commodities. But once again, we haven't heard any attempt to make a shift. And the third, of course, is estimating the growth of the unorganized sector, right? So as a result of all these problems, which started from 2015 onwards, there's a very deep suspicion about using official GDP numbers to get an understanding of how the economy is performing.
So clearly, there are deep-seated problems with India's statistical system, and official data on multiple indicators could be misleading. So, what are some of the repercussions of this?
Right. So let me talk about two important repercussions from the way I see it. First of all, again, going back to the GDP data problems, increasingly we know that the GDP data is conveying an aggregate picture of the economy that does not match with the picture that is getting painted by many high frequency indicators or data that we are getting from micro data series, for example, firm level data or household level data, or even project investment level data, right? As a result of that, for example, now in the post pandemic period, increasingly it seems to be the case that some indicators are pointing towards a slowing economy, whereas the GDP data is conveying a message that India is a very fast growing, very high growth economy, right? Some are saying that it's a K-shaped economy where one segment of the economy has taken off spectacularly, whereas the large segment of the economy comprising the unorganized sector, agriculture, the MSMEs, etc., that they are not performing well, right? You can call it a dual economy. Some are saying it's a new economy versus old economy. But the bottom line is that the message conveyed by the GDP numbers does not really tally with what we find on the ground, right? And that is a serious problem because all said and done, the GDP is the most important, as I said, macro indicator that enters into policy making, that is used extensively by researchers, and that is also used for cross-country comparisons. So if there are so many problems with the GDP data, it will affect policy making for sure, which has been happening. For example, if the economy is indeed slowing down, which is not captured by the GDP data, then we need a certain kind of policies that are not being implemented right now, right? And of course, then there are problems with conducting research, investors trying to figure out what are the growth prospects, and even in cross-country comparisons. Is India truly the fastest growing large economy in the world, right? Or are there a lot of discrepancies in the growth story that are not getting captured? The second problem, which I think is even more serious, has to do with trust in official statistics, right? Now, as a result of measurement problems in the GDP data, measurement problems in several other indicators, for example, index of industrial production that I didn't talk about, but much has been written about it. As a result of these measurement problems, as a result of delays in crucial surveys, release of very little information in the public domain on behalf of the statistical authorities, lack of engagement of the statistical authorities with stakeholders and data users, opacity, general opacity of the statistical system. As a result of all of these, over a period of time, the trust in the statistical system has gotten significantly eroded. And as I started saying that by now, the credibility of official statistics has hit a rock bottom.
Mm-hmm.
What does that do? What this does is that stakeholders and data users who have to use data, they can't do without data, of course, they are increasingly taking recourse to various high-frequency indicators, various other data sources to figure out what's happening in the economy. Now, what this does is it kind of creates a situation where there can be cherry picking about some kind of data series or data indicators, depending upon which part of the narrative you want to fit in, right? And this makes it very difficult to build a consensus about basic economic facts. And what it does is it starts to destroy the quality and substance of public discourse regarding the state of the economy. And I feel this is exactly what has been happening now. You'll often hear that there are some group of economists or experts who are saying the economy is doing exceedingly well, there are practically no problems with the growth or with the performance of any sector. But there are some who are saying, no, but that's not the straightforward story. As I said, some parts are doing well, some parts are not, and it's much more nuanced than that. And when the consensus building becomes difficult, the discourse gets affected, policymaking gets affected. So these are very serious repercussions for not having a trustworthy, credible statistics system. Now, let me draw this discussion to a close by saying that of late, some attempts are being made to address some of these problems because, of course, much has been discussed and written about these problems. Some committees have been set up to revisit some of these issues, to figure out how the surveys can be improved, when can we have the next base year revision for the national account system, The consumption expenditure survey has been restarted again. So some efforts are underway. Mind you, none of this is unusual or extraordinary. These are all business as usual. We may get surprised or pleasantly surprised because given the state of the statistical system, right? But some efforts are underway to address some of these issues. But the thing is, the kind of deep-seated damage that has persisted over a long period of time, it is going to take a very long time, in my opinion, to restore trust in official statistics. Until that happens, stakeholders and data users, right, policymakers, researchers, analysts, commentators, investors, whoever is using official data, will have to continue to operate in an environment where we are essentially flying blind. And that is deeply unfortunate for an economy that aspires to achieve a developed country status by a certain year. And I'll just end with that.
Thank you so much for giving us such a comprehensive view of these problems that so many stakeholders are dealing with right now. And again, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you so much.